Good morning. This is my last talk about colonialism and imperialism. In contrast to the other two talks, which were general in the sense of drawing on different arguments and different historical and theoretical works, today I'm going to use a book of my own. In fact, the first book I ever wrote, White Britain and Black Ireland, to look at colonial stereotypes, racism, the reasons for it, and why modern imperialism differed in significant ways from imperialism and colonialism in earlier epochs of history. I will allow myself a sip of coffee in this lecture as well. This conversation. In the 1960s, when I was a graduate student and very active in the civil rights movement, I became very interested in the literature on stereotypes and racism. The dominant perspective at the time was Freudian. It suggested that individuals had deep-seated needs for these kinds of prejudices. That was a deeply pessimistic argument because it meant that everybody who was expressing racist views needed to be put on the couch, have intensive analysis before they could be rid of these things. I just didn't believe this was the case. And I chose to do research to examine the ways in which stereotypes and racist attitudes could develop quite independently of any individual having a deep psychological need for them, rather than a social psychological need. I also chose as my case Ireland, because it had three interesting controls. The Irish were white, and after all, differed from other colonial situations. The Irish were European. Macaulay, the famous British historian of the 19th century, had argued that all the knowledge of the East wasn't worth one good shelf in a British library. It was hard to say that about the Irish, who had produced from Edmund Spencer on a fair number of distinguished British cultural figures. And most interestingly, the Irish were Christian. A nice little twist. It was the Irish who had brought Christianity to Britain. And yet what I found was that the stereotype of the Irish was almost in every way the same as the stereotype that American whites had of African Americans. The Irish were childlike, full of rhythm, brash and violent, in need of parental control, sexually precocious, and drunk. Now, that similarity triggered a very interesting question about why such similarities could exist with two very different peoples in very different cultures. And later research indicated that this was a widespread colonial stereotype, not limited to Britain and the United States and the Irish and African Americans. And I documented this in the Irish case by going back to the 12th century, when the Norman conquest of Ireland took place, and looking at accounts that people wrote of the Irish. The first beginning with Gerald de Barry, or Giraldus Cambrensis, as he called himself when he published, which in a way began the stereotype, followed through with travel descriptions of Ireland, much later newspaper accounts, and I was able to document this quite effectively across the ages. And I came up with the following argument, which makes a lot of sense to me. Colonizers were Christian. They were supposed to adhere to a certain set of values and practices. By exterminating locals, or in effect enslaving them, they were violating their Christian values. This created what's known as cognitive dissonance, where elements of your belief system or of your belief system and behavior become contradictory. You need to do something to reconcile them, to reduce the anxiety they otherwise generate. A classic example, and one of the ways in which cognitive dissonance was first established, were studies of smokers in the 1950s and 60s, really the 60s. So increasingly, after the Surgeon General's report in 1959, if I remember correctly, it became evident that smoking was linked with cancer, that it was bad for you. Yet lots of people still smoked. Well, how do you smoke but convince yourself it doesn't do you harm? Well, you deny the evidence. You argue that I'm somehow different. You say, well, I'm only going to smoke for 10 years and then I'll stop. You engage in any number of activities toward this end. But studies found that non-smokers were willing to give very high credence to the evidence that smoking is harmful to your health, whereas smokers were not. And the more you smoked, the less willing you were to credit this evidence. Something similar, I argue, happened with respect to colonialism. That sleights of hand had to be introduced to reconcile behavior and belief systems. The way this was done was twofold. You could deny the people you were colonizing their humanity. By doing so, they didn't belong in the circle in which Christian values apply. Some of you may well know that there was quite an active debate in Spain about whether Native Americans were Christian. Many colonizers, the conquistadores, arguing that they weren't and could be killed or enslaved and treated at will, and priests arguing that they were, so their souls could be saved. In Ireland, you had something similar, with the Irish being portrayed as utter barbarians, and therefore untrustworthy, by nature violent, disloyal, and therefore they could be treated differently than, quote, normal people. This argument began with Gerald de Barry, who was in fact paid to write it, to justify the colonization of Ireland. And it's an interesting story here. The Normans sought papal support for their occupation. And at the time, there was an English pope in Rome. the Irish Christians were not paying their Peter's pence. They were an independent Catholic church, independent church of independent of Rome. So the church wasn't making money from them, and thus had a common interest with the Normans to have them conquered so that they would pay a tithe. That calumny continued through the years and even found full expression in histories written by 18th and 19th century historians David Hume and Thomas Macaulay. The second way in which colonized could be theorized to allow and justify their treatment was by describing them as children. Children, after all, are not ready for independence. They need guidance, supervision, control by adults. And the Irish, like other peoples colonized, were seen as childlike, and many of their attributes were described as those of children. So they were wards of the state, as it were, until they reached a level of maturity where they could assume some degree of self-government. Race entered the picture in the 1840s. Until that time, the Irish were simply seen as not properly developed in a cultural sense. Racism sought to create even deeper divides among peoples and was a product of colonialism. You don't find it in earlier empires. The Romans didn't distinguish people by the color of their skin. Historians today have some difficulty in trying to figure out who was white and who was black. There's evidence that there were emperors of African descent. Racism created this new divide. It's based on a silly notion, but the word race still continues. We talk about different races when in fact there's only one race, the human race. A race or a species being a function of who can procreate with others and produce children as a result, and that of course includes all of humanity. With racism, colonialism became locked into a view that those who were colonized could never rise to the level of civilization of the colonizers. Punch magazine was in the forefront of this change, referred to the Irish as the missing link between the gorilla and the Negro. These kinds of views were assimilated by ordinary people who had no particular need to be prejudiced, but almost with their mother's milk. Assimilated anti-Irish, or in the United States, anti-black, and with Irish immigration, also anti-Irish stereotypes. They were so uniform and so persuasive that it would have taken a very independent person, someone like John Stuart Mill, to see what was happening and to argue against it, and, as you might expect, with little effect. It had serious consequences for policy toward Ireland in Britain, and this pattern, I'm going to argue, became a general one and helps explain the collapse, ultimately, of colonialism. If there was violence and lack of development, the explanation had nothing to do with colonial policy, it had to do with the character of the Irish themselves. So, in effect, stereotypes became partially self-fulfilling. The Irish were treated in ways that made it functional for them to behave in some of the ways of the stereotype. So the violence was a function of protest against English misrule. Development was retarded by the dumping of British products in Ireland in the aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars. Political development by the takeover of Ireland by the British, which reached its full extent with the doing away with the Irish Parliament at the end of the Napoleonic Wars with the Act of Union, or toward the end of the Napoleonic Wars. All of this created conditions which led the British to reverse cause and effect. What was a consequence of their policy, they saw as a cause of the problem, which made them ineffective in any of their responses and led to the rise of nationalist movements. Now, I've focused on Christianity as the source of the stereotype, but in the 19th century, a second important source developed, which was liberalism. To the extent that liberal values spread, and liberal values in the most general sense of treating individuals equally, of governing by the rule of law, of recognizing the value of democracy, of trying to do away certainly with political and social inequalities. All of this led to a sharper understanding of the contradictions between these emerging values and the practices of colonialism. It's not surprising that the greatest internal opposition to colonialism arose in the 19th and early 20th century in Britain on the part of the liberal left elite, and later on the continent, because Britain was the most liberal nation and certainly the most liberal in its political practices. So this threw colonization into a sharper perspective. It heightened these contradictions, and it created a policy dilemma for the British and, to a lesser extent, other colonial powers. Because colonialism was so exploitative, it led to nationalist movements demanding autonomy and then independence. The British government was unwilling to do this with the Irish, in part because there was still lots of opposition to it at home, based on groups who had decided economic and political advantages from keeping colonialism going, supported by those who imbibed the Irish stereotype and thought colonialism the only appropriate form of rule. So they were constrained. On the other hand, they were also constrained from using the kind of violence to maintain their authority effectively. Now, they were not averse, in the case of British colonies, of using force, but nothing along the order that, let's say, the Germans did it in Southwest Africa, or the Nazis would later do it in occupied Europe. So they couldn't really use force effectively, and they couldn't bring about the changes and reforms that might have reconciled people or granted independence at a time when it was seen as a generous move rather than something extracted by blood. So created the conditions under which colonialism would fail. There were, of course, external conditions as well. World War I, but more importantly, World War II, which opened in the Pacific with the defeat of the British by the Japanese and destroyed the myth of British superiority to the extent that it existed, and pressure from the two dominant powers at the end of World War II, the Soviet Union and the United States, to end empires. So all of these came together, and they led to voluntary unraveling of empire. In Britain, much less so in France, where there was the wars in Indochina, in Algeria, in Madagascar against independence, and considerably less so in Portugal and Spain, which were, after all, not democratic countries. And their colonies really only became independent, leaving aside the Latin American ones in the 19th century, after revolutions in Portugal and Spain brought democratic governments into power. So colonialism created the conditions of its own downfall. It took a long time, and it was a tragic story for the most part, but it's one from which important lessons about international relations can be learned.